She picked up the wrong suitcase at the airport. Inside, she found intimate letters from a billionaire. Her life changed the moment he showed up at her door.
The reflection of the sunset on the airplane window seemed to want to say something, maybe a final goodbye, maybe just another silent promise that Emersyn Parker wouldn't be able to keep. She pressed her forehead against the cold surface, feeling the soft hum of the engines coursing through her body like a reminder that she was still alive, still breathing, still moving forward. But moving forward is a deceptive concept when you carry inside yourself an absence so vast it takes up more space than any presence ever did. 30 years old, literature professor, recent widow. 3 words that summed up her identity in that moment, but none of them said who she really was beneath the grief she wore like a second coat. Miami waited below, vibrant and relentless, with its humid heat and colors that seemed to scream, "Live!" while she could barely whisper, "I'm trying." The city never slept, never stopped, never allowed anyone to stand still for too long, and maybe that was exactly why Emersyn had chosen to come back. Or maybe she hadn't chosen anything at all. Maybe she'd just followed the script life had written for her. Scatter the ashes, go back home, resume the routine, pretend everything was under control. The truth, though, was more complicated. The truth was that she no longer knew what home meant when the person who turned any place into one was no longer there. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, and Emersyn felt her stomach turn, not from the turbulence, but from the certainty that she'd have to get off and face another day, another week, another month of carefully prepared lessons, of polite smiles for colleagues who asked, "How are you?" without really wanting to know the answer, of lonely nights where the silence of the apartment echoed so loudly she had to turn on the TV just to avoid hearing her own thoughts. She grabbed her purse from under the seat in front of her, checked that her phone was on silent, as if anyone would call, and braced herself to disembark. The routine was calling. The routine always called. In the airport terminal, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with announcements about boarding gates and delayed flights, creating a chaotic symphony that Emersyn already knew by heart. She walked toward the baggage carousel with mechanical steps, watching suitcases spin in endless circles, a perfect metaphor for how she'd felt these past months. Going in circles, always coming back to the same place, always carrying the same weight. When her suitcase, or what she thought was her suitcase, finally appeared, she pulled it with a force that surprised even herself, as if she were yanking something from deep within her own soul.
It was only when she got home, when she opened the apartment door and felt that stale air that smelled of old books and recent loneliness, that Emersyn noticed the first sign that something was different. The suitcase was black, the right size, with wheels that squeaked the same way. But when she set it on the bed and unzipped it, her heart gave a strange leap. Perfectly folded men's shirts, a silver laptop, a leather case with expensive pens, and in the side pocket, a yellowed envelope with the name Dominic Warren written by hand. It wasn't her suitcase, and somehow, inexplicably, that made her feel something she hadn't felt in months: curiosity. She should have closed the suitcase immediately, should have called the airport, should have done what any sensible person would do. But Emersyn wasn't feeling sensible. She was feeling tired of being the woman who always did the right thing, the professor who never lost control, the widow who endured everything with silent dignity. So she picked up the envelope, opened it slowly, like someone opening a door they know they shouldn't open, and began reading words that weren't meant for her, but that seemed to have been written directly to the hole that inhabited her chest. Letters of regret, confessions about wrong priorities, pleas for forgiveness that came too late. And there, sitting on the edge of the bed, surrounded by a stranger's clothes and the unspoken words of a man she'd never seen, Emersyn Parker realized something terrifying. She wasn't crying over the letter. She was crying because finally, after so long, someone, even unknowingly, had put into words exactly what she had never been able to say out loud about her own marriage, about her own choices, about the weight of loving someone and still feeling invisible. The wrong suitcase had arrived, and maybe, just maybe, it had arrived at the right time.
Night fell over Miami like a heavy curtain, but Emersyn was still awake, sitting on the living room couch with the letters scattered around her like pieces of a puzzle she shouldn't be assembling. Each line she read pulled her deeper into the life of Dominic Warren, a man she didn't know, but who somehow she already knew better than many people she dealt with daily. He wrote about meetings that mattered more than birthdays, about promotions that cost family dinners, about the exact moment he realized he'd built a professional empire on the rubble of his own marriage. And Emersyn recognized every word. Recognized it because she'd lived on the other side of that equation, had been the wife who waited, who understood, who said, "It's okay," when nothing was okay. She should return the suitcase. That was the right thing to do. Call the airport in the morning, report the mistake, wait for someone to make the exchange. Simple, practical, no involvement. But there was something about those letters that kept her from simply zipping it up and forgetting about it. Maybe it was the raw honesty, the vulnerability of a man who clearly wasn't used to exposing himself. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in months, she was feeling something other than numbness, a strange, almost impossible connection with someone through words that were never sent. Dominic Warren had written those letters to his ex-wife, but hadn't had the courage to deliver them. And Emersyn, who spent her days teaching about the courage of literary characters, understood perfectly what it was like to be afraid of your own words. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and Katie Rhodes, her coworker, and the only person who still insisted on asking how she really was, had sent a message. "Survived the first day back? Coffee tomorrow?" Emersyn typed a quick response, something about being tired but fine, and put the phone back down. Lying to Katie was getting easier and easier, which was concerning, but how could she explain that she was spending the night reading the intimate confessions of a stranger? How could she say that those words made more sense to her than any conversation she'd had in the past weeks? Impossible. So she simply said nothing. The next morning came too quickly, bringing with it the relentless light of the Miami sun that poured through the windows and exposed the emotional mess Emersyn had created in the living room. She gathered the letters carefully, almost reverently, and placed them back in the envelope. She put everything back in the suitcase, zipped it up, and for a moment stood there staring at that object that didn't belong to her, but that somehow already carried a piece of her. She had to return it, had to do the right thing. But when she picked up her phone to call the airport, she hesitated. And it was in that 3-second hesitation that the doorbell rang. Emersyn's heart raced before she even opened the door. A strange premonition, a feeling that whatever was on the other side was going to change something. She quickly fixed her hair, cleared her throat, and opened it. And there he was, Dominic Warren in the flesh, with deep circles under his eyes that betrayed a sleepless night, wrinkled clothes that suggested he'd come straight from the airport, and an expression of relief so intense when he saw the black suitcase in the hallway behind her that it almost made him seem vulnerable. "You have no idea how long I spent looking for this," he said, with a hoarse voice that carried exhaustion and gratitude in equal parts. And Emersyn, who had mentally rehearsed a dozen polite ways to simply return the suitcase and close the door, suddenly found herself unable to say anything. Because there, before her, stood the man behind the words she'd read all night long, the man who had written about regrets with a sincerity that hurt, the man who, like her, carried the weight of having loved imperfectly. And there was something in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep, a sadness he'd tried to hide behind a polite smile, that made Emersyn realize he was broken too. Maybe not in the same way she was, maybe not for the same reasons, but broken nonetheless. And when he reached out to grab the suitcase, their fingers touched for a fraction of a second, and it was as if an electric current ran through the space between two strangers who shared secrets without knowing it. I read the letters, Emersyn said, and the words came out before she could stop them, before the rational and controlled professor could censor the exhausted and lonely woman she'd become. Dominic froze, his hand still on the suitcase handle, his gaze fixed on her with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like relief. I shouldn't have read them, she continued quickly, feeling her cheeks flush. But I did, and I understood every word. The silence that followed was so charged with emotion, it seemed to fill the entire hallway, the entire building, the entire noisy city outside. And then Dominic did something neither of them expected. He didn't get angry, didn't demand explanations, didn't grab the suitcase and leave. Instead, he took a deep breath, like someone who had finally been given permission to take a weight off his shoulders, and asked, "Would you like to get some coffee?"
The coffee was 3 blocks from Emersyn's apartment, tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. One of those places tourist Miami didn't know about, but local residents guarded like a precious secret. She'd been coming here almost every day since she returned to the city, always at the same time, always ordering the same thing, black coffee and a croissant she never finished. It was part of the routine, part of the illusion of normalcy she was trying to build. But today was different. Today, she wasn't alone. Dominic walked beside her in silence, hands in his pockets, gaze lost on the streets, wet from the rain that had started falling minutes after they left the building, as if even the sky knew this moment needed a more dramatic soundtrack. When they entered, the door chime tinkled softly, and the aroma of freshly ground coffee wrapped around them both like a warm embrace. The place was almost empty, just an elderly couple in the corner sharing a piece of pie, and a girl with colorful hair typing furiously on her laptop. Emersyn chose the table by the window, the one where she always sat, where she could watch the rain slide down the glass and pretend she was in a melancholy French film instead of just in her own messy life. Dominic sat across from her, and for the first time since they'd met, she could really observe him. Early 40s, maybe, dark hair with some silver strands at the temples, strong jawline, brown eyes that seemed to carry stories he never told. He was handsome, she realized, but it was a tired beauty, the kind of beauty of someone who forgot to take care of himself while taking care of everything else. "So," he began, with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you read my most pathetic confessions. That puts me at a disadvantage." There was humor in his voice, but also something deeper, a vulnerability he was trying to disguise with lightness. Emersyn picked up the cup of coffee the waitress had just brought, feeling the warmth against her palms, and took a deep breath. "I shouldn't have read them," she repeated, but this time without the weight of guilt she'd carried before. "But I don't regret it, because it had been a long time since I'd felt so understood by words written by someone else. And it was true. It was a strange and inconvenient truth, but it was truth. Dominic's letters had touched something she didn't even know was still alive inside her, the ability to recognize herself in someone else's pain."
Dominic leaned slightly forward, and for the first time since they'd sat down, his smile seemed genuine. "You teach literature, right? It was written on your suitcase tag." Emersyn nodded, surprised he'd noticed. "University of Miami. 7 years now." "And do you love it?" he asked. And it wasn't a casual question. It was a real question, the kind that demands an honest answer. She turned the cup between her hands, watching the dark liquid inside, as if she could find the answer there. "I used to love it," she said finally, and felt the weight of those words. "But lately, I've just been going through the motions, just following the script. And there it was, the confession she hadn't made to Katie or to Dr. Grant or to herself out loud. She had stopped loving what she did. She had stopped loving a lot of things. The rain intensified outside, beating against the window with an urgency that seemed to match perfectly the growing tension between them. Dominic didn't look away. "I understand that," he said quietly, "spending so much time building something that you forget why you started. Waking up one day and realizing you don't recognize your own life anymore." He paused, stirring the sugar he hadn't used. "My letters. I never had the courage to send them. I wrote them, reread them 1,000 times, but never hit send. Because part of me knew that asking for forgiveness wasn't going to change what I did, wasn't going to bring back the birthdays I missed, the dinners I canceled, the moments I let pass because there was always something more important at work." There was a raw pain in those words, and Emersyn felt something break inside her, not from sadness, but from recognition.
"My husband died 6 months ago," she said, and it was the first time she'd been able to talk about it without her voice breaking completely. "Cancer. Fast and cruel. And do you know what's worse? During the last few years before the diagnosis, we were distant. He worked too much, I hid in books. We lived in the same house but in different worlds. And when he got sick, I tried to make up for all that lost time, tried to be the perfect wife, the devoted caregiver. But you can't recover years in months, Dominic. You can't." The tears came, silent and stubborn, and she wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand. Dominic held out a napkin but said nothing, and somehow that respectful silence was worth more than 1,000 empty words of comfort. They stayed there for hours. The coffee went cold, the rain subsided and then came back with force, and they kept talking about regrets, about second chances that never come, about the weight of carrying guilt that never completely disappears. And at some point between one confession and another, between a sip of cold coffee and an unexpected laugh at some lame joke Dominic made to ease the tension, Emersyn realized something extraordinary. She was smiling. For real. Not the polite smile she gave colleagues, not the sad smile she offered when someone asked how she was. A real smile, the kind that comes from within, the kind that makes eyes shine. And when Dominic said, almost casually, "I'd like to watch one of your classes someday, just to see you talking about what you love," she didn't say no, didn't say it was strange that they barely knew each other, that it didn't make sense. She just answered, "American literature, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 3 in the afternoon, room 204, and left the possibility hanging in the air like an unspoken promise.
Tuesday arrived loaded with an anxiety Emersyn hadn't felt in years. That flutter in your stomach when you don't know if something will happen, but part of you secretly hopes it will. She'd spent the entire morning changing clothes 3 times, which was ridiculous because she always wore practically the same style: dress pants, discreet blouse, comfortable shoes. But today there was an annoying voice in her head whispering, "What if he actually shows up?" While another voice, more rational, answered, "So what if he shows up? It's just a class. You've been teaching for 7 years." But it wasn't just a class, and she knew it. Because for the first time in months, she had prepared the content with almost obsessive care, had chosen each excerpt from The Great Gatsby, thinking not only of the students, but of how those words about impossible dreams and second chances would sound to someone specific sitting in the back of the room. The University of Miami was particularly beautiful that afternoon. The sun filtered through the palm trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the path to the Arts Building, and students scattered across the lawn studied or pretended to study while enjoying the perfect weather. Emersyn climbed the steps of the main staircase with her heart racing, greeted the security guard with a mechanical wave, and walked down the hallway she knew by heart. Room 204. Her room. Her safe territory. But when she pushed the door open and entered, she found something she didn't expect. The room was full. Not unusual for an American literature class, but today it felt different.
The students chatted animatedly, flipping through their books, and then she saw him. Dominic Warren, sitting in the last row, by the window, wearing a light blue button-down shirt and the air of someone doing something completely outside their comfort zone, but determined not to back down.
Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, long enough for Emersyn to feel her stomach turn and for a small smile, almost imperceptible, to appear on his face. She looked away quickly, placing her bag on the desk, opening the worn copy of Fitzgerald she'd read so many times. The pages were marked with colorful post-its and notes in the margins. "All right, everyone," she began, and her voice came out steadier than expected. "Today, we're going to talk about Jay Gatsby and the illusion of the American dream. But more than that, we're going to talk about what it means to chase something that maybe never existed the way we imagined it." And as she spoke, as she walked around the room gesturing, as she always did when she was truly engaged with the subject, she could feel Dominic's gaze on her, not invasive, not uncomfortable, but attentive in a way that made her want to choose each word even more carefully. "Gatsby built an entire life based on an idealized past," Emersyn continued, stopping near the window, the afternoon light creating a golden halo around her. "He believed he could turn back time, that he could recover what he lost, that Daisy's love was still there, untouched, waiting for him. But Fitzgerald shows us that this is the tragedy. We can't go back. We can't erase what happened. We can only—" She hesitated, searching for the right words, and her gaze met Dominic's again. "Only move forward carrying what we learned, and maybe, if we're lucky, find something new that's worth as much as what we lost." The silence that followed was one of those heavy silences, full of meaning. Some students were taking notes furiously. Others just looked at her with that expression of someone who just understood something important, not just about literature, but about life.
A student in the front row, Sophie, always the most participative, raised her hand. "Professor Parker, but do you think Gatsby was wrong to try? Like, even if it was impossible, wasn't there something beautiful about never giving up on what he loved?" Emersyn smiled, because that was exactly the kind of question she loved. There's a difference between not giving up and living trapped in the past, Sophie. Gatsby didn't love Daisy as she really was. He loved the idea of her, the memory he'd kept. And that's not love, it's worshiping a ghost. Real love requires that we see the person as they are now, not as they were. It requires— She paused, feeling the weight of her own words. It requires courage to let go of what was and embrace what can be. And when she said that, she was no longer just talking about Gatsby. She was talking about herself, about Dominic, about everyone who's ever had to choose between honoring the past and allowing themselves a future. The class flowed like it hadn't in a long time. Students participated, asked intelligent questions, debated among themselves, and Emersyn felt that energy she'd almost forgotten, that feeling of being exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she was born to do. And Dominic remained there, in the back of the room, without saying a word, but his presence was like an anchor and a push at the same time. When the bell finally rang and students began packing up their materials, some came to her desk to ask additional questions. Others just thanked her for the class. And Emersyn, who normally would stay there for another 20 minutes answering questions, this time felt a strange urgency for everyone to leave because she knew Dominic was waiting. When the last student left and closed the door, silence descended on the room like a curtain. Dominic stood up slowly, walking to the front with his hands in his pockets, and stopped a few steps away from her, close enough that she could see the small wrinkles around his eyes, far enough to maintain some propriety. "I learned more about love here," he said, and his voice came low, almost intimate, "than in my entire life."
It wasn't a pickup line. It wasn't a phrase for effect. It was a simple and devastatingly honest confession. And Emerson, who had spent years teaching other people about the great love stories of literature, who had analyzed every nuance of passion and desire in the classics, suddenly found herself completely speechless. Because there, between books and glances, something had changed. And she still didn't know if she was ready to name it. But her heart, stubborn and insistent, had already started whispering an answer that her mind didn't want to hear yet.
The days that followed that class were a succession of almost accidental encounters that neither of them had the courage to admit were intentional. Dominic would show up at the cafe where Emerson read every afternoon, always with a plausible excuse. I was just passing by. I needed a quiet place to work. And she pretended to believe him, pretended she hadn't chosen that specific table from where she could see the door, pretended her heart didn't race every time the bell chimed and he walked in. They talked about books he'd never read and now devoured with the hunger of someone who discovered too late the pleasure of literature. They talked about trips she'd never taken and that he described in detail, like someone who had seen the entire world but never really paid attention. And between one coffee and another, between a shared laugh and a comfortable silence, something grew, slow, inevitable, frightening. Katie was the one who noticed first, of course. On Thursday, during the break between classes, she cornered Emerson in the teacher's lounge with that look that said, "I know what's happening, and you're going to tell me everything now." "Who is he?" she asked without beating around the bush, crossing her arms and leaning against the table with a smile that was half amusement, half concern. Emerson pretended not to understand, but Katie wasn't stupid. "The tall, dark, and mysterious man who's been showing up at your classes. The students are talking. They say you're different when he's there, more alive." The word hung in the air like an accusation and a blessing at the same time. Alive. When was the last time someone had used that word to describe her? "He's just a friend," Emerson murmured, organizing papers that didn't need organizing. "Someone I met by chance." Katie raised an eyebrow. "By chance, sure, and I'm happily married." The sarcasm in her voice was evident, but there was also something softer, genuine concern from someone who knew how much Emerson had suffered and didn't want to see her hurt again. But Katie didn't understand. No one understood, because what Emerson felt wasn't just attraction. Though there was that too, she admitted, in sleepless early mornings when she allowed thoughts about Dominic's smile, about his hands turning pages of a book, about the way he looked at her as if she were the most interesting thing in the world to invade her mind. What she felt was guilt. Heavy and suffocating guilt that settled in her chest every time she laughed at something Dominic said, every time she anxiously waited for the next encounter, every time she caught herself thinking about him instead of thinking about the husband she'd lost. How could she be feeling this? How could she be allowing someone else to occupy the space that still seemed to belong to someone who was no longer there? It was as if she were betraying not just a memory, but the entire story she'd lived, all the love that had been real, even when imperfect. Friday night arrived, bringing with it a heavy and unexpected rain, one of those Miami summer storms that turn streets into rivers and force everyone to seek shelter. Emerson was at the university, finishing grading exams in the empty room when she heard the knock on the door. She already knew who it was before even looking up. Dominic was drenched, his hair stuck to his forehead, his wet shirt marking the contour of his chest. And there was something in his eyes, a determination, an urgency that made the air in the room seem thinner. "We need to talk," he said, and it wasn't a request. It was almost a plea. Emerson placed her pen on the desk slowly, as if the gesture could slow down the moment, but she knew there was no escaping this conversation. Not anymore.
He came in, closing the door behind him, and stood there for a second that felt like an eternity. The rain beat violently against the windows, and the occasional lightning illuminated the room, creating dramatic shadows that made everything even more intense. "I'm falling in love with you, Emersyn," Dominic said, all at once, without preparation, without beating around the bush, and the words fell between them like a confession that had been held back for too long. "I know it's early, I know it's complicated, I know you're probably not ready yet, but I needed to say it because I don't want to make the same mistake again. I don't want to let another chance pass to be honest about what I feel while there's still time." He took a deep breath, and she could see his hands trembling slightly. "You reminded me that there's life beyond work, that there's beauty in small things, that there's possibility. And I don't know what to do with that, but I also can't pretend it's not happening."
Emersyn's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Part of her wanted to run to him, wanted to say she felt the same, that the past weeks had been the first in months when she'd woken up with something other than obligation in her chest. But there was a stronger, crueler voice whispering, "What about Michael? What about the vows you made? What about the love you swore would be eternal?" How could she be standing there, considering starting something new, when the pain of loss was still so fresh, when there were still his clothes in the closet she didn't have the courage to donate, when she still picked up the phone to call him before remembering there was no one on the other end of the line anymore? "I can't," she said finally, and her voice came out broken, loaded with everything she wasn't saying. "Dominic, I can't do this. Not now. Maybe never. Because if I let you in, if I allow this to become real, then I'll be admitting that he's truly gone. And I don't know if I'm ready for that." The tears came, silent and inevitable, and Dominic took a step forward but stopped when she raised her hand, creating an invisible barrier between them. "You're not betraying anyone by moving forward," he said softly, and there was so much understanding in his voice it hurt even more. "You're not forgetting. You're just allowing there to be space for more than one kind of love in your life. What you had with him was real, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve to have something new too." He ran his hand through his wet hair, frustrated with himself, with the situation, with the impossibility of it all. "But I understand. I understand if you don't want to risk it, if you want me to leave and never show up again. I just needed you to know." And then he turned to leave, and each of his steps toward the door felt like it was ripping a piece from Emersyn's chest. She should let him go. It was the right thing, the safe thing. But when his hand touched the doorknob, she heard her own voice, small but firm. "Don't go, please, just don't go yet." And there, surrounded by books about great loves and romantic tragedies, between the storm outside and the storm inside their own chests, they stayed. Two broken hearts, trying to figure out if it was possible to put the pieces together without cutting themselves even more in the process.
The week that followed that rainy night was the longest Emersyn had ever lived. Dominic hadn't left, not completely. He had stayed there, sitting in one of the students' desks while she remained standing, leaning against the table, and the two of them had talked for hours until the rain stopped and the silence between words became as significant as the words themselves. But since then, there had been a careful distance between them. Him respecting the space she'd asked for without asking, her trying desperately to figure out if what she felt was true love or just fear disguised as loyalty. And it was when she was most confused, most lost, that the students did something that would change everything. The following Monday, when Emersyn walked into the classroom for another class, she found on her desk a thick envelope full of handwritten letters. "What's this?" she asked, looking at the class with genuine confusion. So he smiled, that smile of someone who knows a good secret and is dying to tell. "It's a project we did, Professor, about love and second chances. You asked us to analyze the idea of renewal in Fitzgerald, remember? So each of us wrote about someone or something that inspired us to believe it's possible to start over." Emersyn picked up the envelope with trembling hands, and when she started reading, she felt the world around her disappear. Letter after letter talked about her, about how her classes had changed in recent weeks, how she seemed more present, more passionate about what she taught. One student wrote, "Professor Parker was always good, but now she's amazing. It's like she remembered why she loves literature, and that made us remember why we're here too."
But it was Sophie's letter that completely destroyed her. "I know about the man who sits in the back of the room," she had written in that young and enthusiastic handwriting, "and I know you're scared, but I wanted you to know that since he showed up, you've started shining again. And if there's something I learned in your classes about the great romances, it's that true love doesn't erase what came before, it honors it. So maybe, Professor, honoring who you loved means allowing yourself to love again. Because seeing you like this, happy and scared at the same time, I finally understood what all these stories we read were trying to tell us, that living is risking your heart, always, again and again." Emersyn had to sit down, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The students watched in silence, and she realized they knew. Everyone knew. And instead of judgment, there was only hope on the young faces before her, the pure hope of those who still believe stories can have happy endings. She canceled the following classes, something she had never ever done in 7 years of her career. She got in her car and drove aimlessly, ending up, as always happens in decisive moments, at the place where it all began, Miami International Airport. She parked and sat there, watching planes take off and land through the windshield, thinking about all the arrivals and departures that place had witnessed, about all the love stories that began or ended within those gates. It was here she had returned months ago, carrying ashes and memories. It was here she had picked up the wrong suitcase. It was here that, unknowingly, she had taken the first step toward Dominic Warren and a possibility that still terrified her. And it was here that she finally understood. It wasn't betrayal. It never had been. Michael wouldn't want her to spend the rest of her life trapped in eternal grief. He had been many things, distant, workaholic, imperfect, but he had never been selfish enough to want her to die along with him. She picked up her phone, fingers trembling as she typed a message to Dominic, "Airport, North Terminal, now." And then she waited with her heart in her throat, with a million doubts still circling her mind, but also with the new clarity, frightening and liberating at the same time. She had spent months building walls around her heart, convinced that protecting it meant never risking again. But the students were right. Sophie was right. All the literature she had taught for years was right. Living was risking. Loving was risking. And she was tired of just existing when she could be living. 20 minutes passed, the longest of her life. And then she saw him. Dominic crossing the parking lot, almost running, with that expression of someone who doesn't understand what's happening but is willing to find out, with that determination she already knew so well.
When he got close to the car, she got out, standing there in the middle of the noisy airport parking lot with the sound of airplane engines in the background and the smell of fuel in the air. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't like in the movies, but it was real. And maybe that was exactly what she needed. Something imperfect, chaotic, human. "I read the letters," she said, echoing the first word she had said to him weeks ago. "The students wrote about how I changed, about how I fell in love with what I do again. And they're right, I changed. Because of you." Dominic took a step forward, cautious, as if approaching something fragile that could break at any moment. "Emersyn, let me finish," she interrupted, and her voice came out firmer than expected. "I spent months thinking that honoring my husband meant staying trapped in the past, but I was wrong. Honoring him means living the life he can't live anymore. It means not wasting time. It means—" She took a deep breath, feeling tears appear again, but this time they weren't tears of pain. "It means having the courage to love again, even knowing it might hurt." Dominic closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and held her face between his hands with a gentleness that contrasted with the urgency in his gaze. "I can't promise it'll be easy," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm a recovering workaholic. You're dealing with grief. We're both a disaster in terms of timing. But I can promise I'll prioritize you, that I will be present, that I won't make the same mistakes I made before." And then he smiled, that smile that had the ability to illuminate even the darkest corners of her heart. "I can promise I'll read all the books you want to recommend, even if some are boring." Emerson laughed, a real laugh, light, liberating, and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Gatsby wasn't boring," she murmured against his chest. "You just weren't paying attention." "I was," he replied, kissing the top of her head, "just not to the book."
And there, in the parking lot of an airport where thousands of stories crossed every day, where people said goodbye and reunited, where endings and beginnings happened every instant, Emersyn Parker finally understood what all her favorite authors had tried to say over the years. That love wasn't about never feeling pain, but about having the courage to feel, even knowing pain was possible. That second chances didn't erase first loves. They just proved that the human heart had infinite capacity when it allowed itself to open again. When they pulled apart, Dominic took an envelope from his pocket. Different, smaller than the ones she had found in his suitcase weeks ago. "I wrote one more letter," he said, handing it to her. "But this one I'm sending, because I learned that words only have power when they're shared." Emerson opened it with trembling fingers and read, "To the one who saved my life without knowing it. Thank you for teaching me it's never too late to start over. Dominic." And when she looked up, she saw in his eyes the reflection of her own future. Uncertain, frightening, but full of possibilities she was finally ready to embrace.
Just as Emerson discovered that honoring the past doesn't mean living trapped in it, each of us carries within the power of transformation and new beginnings. Her journey reminds us that the human heart wasn't made to choose between what was and what can be. It was made to embrace both, honoring each chapter while writing the next with renewed courage. Stories like this show us that it's never too late to allow love back into our lives. That second chances don't diminish first loves, but prove we're capable of growing, of healing, of making room for new connections without erasing the memories that shaped us. True renewal doesn't happen when we forget, but when we have the courage to remember and still move forward. If this story touched you in some way, if it awakens something dormant inside your chest, write in the comments, "Love transforms lives." We want to hear how this journey of Emerson and Dominic resonated with your own story. Subscribe to Eternal Romance Stories and experience with each episode emotions that warm the soul and reflections that transform the heart. Here you'll find stories that don't just entertain, but that touch deeply, that make you believe in the power of love, human connection, and the second chances life offers us when we least expect them. And this was just one of the many stories that will still move you here, because in the end, we're all writing our own new beginnings. And sometimes, all we need is the courage to pick up the wrong suitcase to find the right path.